Welcome to the Golden Gems podcast. Today we're taking a deep dive into Nicholas Sand, the clandestine chemist who synthesized over 140 million doses of orange sunshine LSD and survived for decades as an international fugitive.
Yeah, and before we really get into the timeline, I want you to just picture this. It's 1996. You're in this quiet, sleepy suburb in British Columbia, Canada.
Right.
The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they basically kick down the door of what looks like just a mundane warehouse in an industrial park.
Just a standard, boring commercial space.
Exactly. But inside, sitting right there among all this industrial glassware, is 43 grams of pure crystalline powder. And I mean, 43 grams, that doesn't sound like much, right? You could literally hold it in the palm of your hand.
But with LSD, that's a terrifying amount.
It's enough to trigger 45 million distinct ego deaths. Like that handful of dust was enough to dose the entire population of Canada 1.5 times over.
Which is just, it's hard to even wrap your head around. And, here we are in the year 2026. You look at the medical landscape today, and psychedelic molecules are, well, they're completely sanitized.
Yeah, they're fully institutionalized now.
Right. They're subjects of FDA-approved clinical trials. You've got people getting dosed in these sterile rooms at major research universities by doctors in white coats. But the mission of this deep dive isn't to look at that clinical present. We are going back to explore the chaotic, highly illegal, and just profoundly radical origins of this entire movement.
And to do that, we have to forensically break down Nicholas Sand's life. We are essentially looking at a study of ideological absolute commitment. We're going to examine his genealogical blueprint for erasure, his unmatched technical synthesis of these incredibly fragile compounds.
And the paradox, right? The philosophical paradox his legacy leaves for today's medical establishment.
Absolutely. Because you really have to understand where Sand came from to understand how he was able to disappear so completely later in his life.
Yeah.
I mean, he wasn't even born Nicholas Sand.
Yeah. Right. He was Nicholas Francis Hiskey, born May 10th, 1941 in Brooklyn. And his father, Clarence Hiskey, was a researcher at the University of Chicago. But this wasn't, it wasn't just standard academia.
Not at all. Clarence Hiskey was embedded deep within the Metallurgical laboratory.
Sure.
So for those familiar with World War II history, that is a highly classified, top-secret node of the Manhattan Project.
Right.
His father was literally working on the infrastructure for nuclear weapons. But here is the massive twist. Clarence wasn't just some loyal government operative. Military intelligence eventually identified him as attempting to funnel classified atomic secrets directly to the Soviet Union.
Wait, so his dad is working on the Manhattan Project and actively trying to pass atomic secrets to the Soviets. The stakes of that are just staggering.
Oh, it's the ultimate betrayal of state secrets. And when those espionage activities were uncovered, it triggered this complete catastrophic family collapse.
Yeah, I imagine.
The ensuing divorce, it wasn't just a legal separation for the family. It forced a desperate act of identity erasure. His mother reverted to her maiden name, and the name Nicholas Francis Hiskey was effectively erased from the public record. In its place, the identity of Nicholas Sand was constructed.
Which is such a wild foundation for a childhood. When you look at Sand's life, you realize his earliest lesson in survival was that identity itself is just a malleable construct.
Yeah.
It's much like the chemical compounds he would later synthesize, right? He learned how to shed a burned persona. And that specific tradecraft, that ability to manipulate who you are on paper and in the physical world, that is exactly what would keep him alive decades later as an international fugitive.
He learned how to become a ghost as a kid. He really did. He understood that consensus reality, even something as fixed as your own legal identity, is just an agreed-upon fiction. And he applies that radical flexibility to his own life trajectory. So in 1959, instead of taking the standard path into the American collegiate system, he executes this massive pivot. He leaves the country entirely, moves to Israel, and embeds himself in an agricultural kibbutz for an entire year.
So going from Brooklyn to an agricultural commune in the Middle East, what was the draw there? Why a kibbutz?
Well, it was about internalizing a structural blueprint. The kibbutz system was intense. It demanded absolute physical labor and, critically, the complete subjugation of the individual ego.
Right, putting the group first.
You had to prioritize collective survival above any personal desire.
Yeah.
You're digging ditches, sharing meals, erasing the I for the we. And that year instilled in him a blueprint for communal living, resource sharing, and collective ideological focus.
Which is exactly the foundation he tries to replicate later.
Right, with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love in California.
Yeah, sure.
Exactly.
So he takes that blueprint back to the U.S. in 1961, and he enrolls at Brooklyn College to study anthropology. He's diving into human cultures, ritual practices, and specifically the consciousness-altering substances used by indigenous societies. It provides this perfect intellectual framework for what's coming.
Yeah.
But the real turning point, the moment where everything just definitively shifts, happens that same year when he consumes his first dose of LSD.
And it is vital to understand that for Sand, this wasn't, a recreational party experience in a dorm room.
Yeah.
It was what he explicitly described as an ontological catastrophe.
Hold on. Ontological catastrophe, that is a really dense phrase. You mean his basic understanding of what was real just completely shattered?
Precisely. I mean, put yourself in his shoes for a second.
Yeah.
You are a kid from Brooklyn who just spent a year in a kibbutz, and suddenly you ingest this microscopic chemical that proves to you, on a visceral level, that human perception is infinitely malleable. The world you thought was solid is just a chemical illusion. That realization permanently dismantled his consensus reality. He saw that consciousness itself could be chemically reprogrammed.
Which completely changes his relationship with academia, obviously. He gets his bachelor's in 1963, immediately enrolls in a graduate program at San Francisco State University, focusing on ethnobotany and consciousness. But Sand is sitting in these sterile university libraries studying consciousness, and he looks out the window at Haight-Ashbury, where the counterculture is just exploding.
Yeah, the scene is already taking off.
Right. You have Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters, the Grateful Dead playing venues, soaked in this new psychedelic atmosphere, and he realizes that reading about it isn't going to trigger a revolution.
No, studying it in a library wasn't going to change the world. He sees that if you want mass cognitive expansion, you absolutely require mass chemical production.
So in 1966, at 25 years old, he just drops out, leaves his graduate studies, moves to a small farmhouse in rural Windsor, California, and sets up his first clandestine laboratory. And I think we need to talk about what that actually takes, because synthesizing LSD isn't like brewing beer in your bathtub.
Oh, not even close. LSD is an incredibly fragile molecule. Think of it like trying to build a delicate house of cards in a wind tunnel. If a single ray of ultraviolet light hits it, or if oxygen sneaks into the flask, the chemical bonds just snap.
It degrades instantly.
Right, and your revolutionary sacrament turns into useless, inactive sludge. That's why he had to literally replace the oxygen in the room with nitrogen just to keep the molecule alive.
That's insane.
You need precise pH control. It's a grueling multi-step synthesis pathway, starting with a highly regulated precursor chemical called ergotamine tartrate.
But Sand was meticulous. He was entirely forensic in his methodology. By late 1966, he had perfected the process. And his LSD wasn't just good. It was exceptionally pure, highly potent, reliable. Word starts spreading through the underground network, and his reputation inevitably draws the attention of a group looking for exactly his skill set.
Which brings us to the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Because Sand realizes that to achieve this planetary cognitive shift, he needs infrastructure. He collides with this group that didn't just want to sell these molecules, but viewed them as literal sacraments. The Brotherhood was founded by John Griggs, who was a former street gang member from Anaheim, who had this profound spiritual awakening on LSD.
We should definitely clarify that the Brotherhood was not your standard drug cartel. They were a quasi-religious collective. They established a commune in Laguna Beach. They operated a surf shop as a front. But their actual driving mission was the global distribution of LSD and hashish to fund a psychedelic revolution.
Yeah, they were literally smuggling hashish from Afghanistan to California inside hollowed-out surfboards to fund their labs.
It's incredibly audacious. So in 1967, Sand is introduced to Tim Scully. And Scully is this brilliant young chemist who had previously worked with Augustus Owsley Stanley III, the legendary original acid chemist for the Grateful Dead.
Right. Scully had the technical expertise and the sophisticated equipment. Sand had the anthropological understanding of ritual use and this unyielding commitment to mass distribution.
So they start establishing these remote, sophisticated laboratories to avoid the constant surveillance of urban environments. First in Point Richmond, California, and then, in a move that is almost impossible to believe, they set up shop in an abandoned atomic energy lab in Denver, Colorado.
It's wild.
I really want you to think about the profound historical irony and the massive philosophical weight of this. Sand and Scully literally take over a government facility equipped with industrial-scale machinery, climate control, security infrastructure. They're using the exact industrial machinery of the Cold War to mass manufacture the ultimate weapon of the counterculture.
They turned a site designed for nuclear destruction into a pharmaceutical-grade factory for ego death. The poetry of that is astounding, especially considering Sand's father's ties to the Manhattan Project.
Right.
The son is literally reclaiming the machinery of the father's era. And in this Denver lab, their synthesis process becomes revolutionary. Instead of liquid drops or blotter paper, they begin pressing uniform orange tablets. Each tablet contained a highly precise 300 microgram dose.
Which is a massive dose by today's clinical standards, where a standard therapeutic dose might be, what, 100 micrograms?
Massive, yeah, 100 or even less today. They achieve the orange color by adding tartrazine dye, and they stamp them with distinctive markings. This was the birth of Orange Sunshine, easily the most iconic LSD formulation in human history.
So between 1967 and 1969, they produced millions of these tablets. The Brotherhood distributed them globally. Rainbow gatherings, college campuses, rock concerts. The molecule just spread like a viral contagion, culminating in August 1969 at the Woodstock Festival. The festival was absolutely saturated with Orange Sunshine. We are talking about an estimated 300,000 people dosed on sans acid over a single weekend. The cognitive impact of that event alone was planetary.
But you cannot operate at that scale without attracting the full force of the federal government. So in 1969, the DEA launches Operation BEL, which is this massive multi-year investigation targeting the entire Brotherhood network. Wiretaps, infiltration, constant surveillance. The pressure just becomes immense.
And the structure begins to crack. In 1972, the spiritual leader of the Brotherhood, John Griggs, tragically dies from a fatal overdose.
Yeah.
Wait, an overdose? Classic psychedelics are notoriously difficult, if not impossible, to fatally overdose on. What actually happened?
Well, it wasn't standard LSD. He ingested a massive miscalculated dose of pure synthetic psilocybin.
Oh, wow.
While organic psilocybin mushrooms are physically safe, the sheer concentration of the experimental pure synthetic crystal just completely overpowered his system. His death was a devastating blow to the group.
And Sand, who is always meticulous, reads the writing on the wall. He recognizes the operation is collapsing. On August 5, 1972, the DEA executes massive, coordinated raids across California, arresting dozens of members, seizing massive quantities of drugs and cash. But when they kicked down Sand's door...
He's already gone.
Exactly. He had vanished to Canada just days before the raid.
The man who synthesized tens of millions of doses of Orange Sunshine just becomes a ghost.
Which shifts the narrative entirely. We go from this very public, sun-drenched counterculture triumph to a life of severe, isolated paranoia. How does a man who sought to unify human consciousness survive a quarter-century cutoff from everyone he knows?
Well, he spends the next 24 years as a fugitive, utilizing literal military-grade operational security. He creates a fully fabricated alias, David Roy Shepard. And this wasn't just a fake ID. He constructed an entire life. Employment history, social connections, tax documents. He was constantly moving across British Columbia, never establishing a traceable pattern.
Just put yourself in Sand's shoes for a second. Every time you go to the grocery store, every time the phone rings, you're calculating if the FBI has finally found you. I want to probe the severe psychological contradiction of these fugitive years, because it is fascinating. Here is a man dedicating his life to manufacturing a molecule that is specifically designed to dissolve boundaries, eliminate the ego, and foster universal collective connection.
Right.
Yet he is forced to do this from a state of permanent, crushing paranoia. He is entirely isolated. He is spreading universal love while living in total terror.
That contradiction is absolutely the defining tension of his exile. But the isolation didn't stop the mission. I mean, his compulsion to manufacture wasn't driven by profit. It was a religious imperative. He genuinely believed that humanity was on a destructive trajectory and required chemical intervention to survive. So he just built new, hidden labs. He produced DMT, MDMA, MDA, and of course continued to synthesize LSD.
And this all peaks in 1996. He establishes the most sophisticated laboratory of his entire career in an industrial park in Port Coquitlam, which is a quiet suburb of Vancouver. This was a massive pharmaceutical-grade operation. Industrial glassware, precision temperature controls, proper ventilation for toxic fumes. He had the capacity to store hundreds of kilograms of chemicals.
His operational security was flawless when it came to his identity, but chemistry always leaves a supply chain trail. To synthesize LSD, you need massive amounts of precursor chemicals, and his suspicious high-volume orders of ergotamine tartrate finally triggered the Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
Right, they noticed the paper trail.
Exactly. The RCMP initiated a highly classified surveillance operation, tracking his movements and documenting deliveries for months.
So, on September 26, 1996, the RCMP executes that staggering tactical raid we talked about on the Port Coquitlam facility.
Yeah?
Let's look at the exact chemical forensics of what they seized, because the numbers are almost incomprehensible. They found 5 kilograms of pure DMT, 3.5 kilograms of MDMA, 5 kilograms of MDA, 2.5 kilograms of ergotamine tartrate. But the absolute crown jewel of the seizure was that 43 grams of pure crystalline LSD.
Which, as we mentioned earlier, is sufficient to manufacture approximately 45 million individual doses.
So following the raid, Sand is captured, but he remains a total cipher. For 2 months in a Canadian detention facility, he sits in absolute silence. He refuses to give his true identity, because David Roy Shepard doesn't exist prior to his constructed history, and he knows it.
But biology betrays him.
Yeah.
The RCMP forwards his fingerprints to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C., and the biometric match shatters his 24 years of evasion. The system lights up. The architect of Orange Sunshine is finally identified.
Wow.
In 1998, knowing he's trapped, he pleads guilty to manufacturing in Canada and receives a 9-year sentence. But crucially, this runs concurrently with the 15-year American sentence he evaded back in 1972. The man who tried to free the human mind is locked in a concrete cage.
Which brings us to a profound question about how history measures a legacy, especially when the crime of the past becomes the medicine of the future. Sand is released from prison in 2001, and he doesn't emerge as a broken, defeated convict. He walks out as a revered elder statesman of a psychedelic movement that had completely transformed while he was inside.
He expressed absolutely zero regret. He maintained, with total unwavering certainty, that violating federal law on a massive scale was a profound moral imperative. In a 2009 National Geographic interview, he estimated his lifetime output over 3 decades of clandestine manufacturing. Across multiple continents, dozens of labs, always under threat of capture, he calculated that he successfully synthesized 140 million individual doses of LSD.
Wait, I have to challenge this narrative of him as a pure savior, though. We're talking about a rogue chemist making a unilateral decision for human evolution. Dumping 140 million doses of a hyper-potent hallucinogen into an unprepared society is incredibly reckless. I mean, he wasn't a doctor. He was answering to no one. Doesn't that border on megalomania?
That is the central friction of his legacy right there. He wasn't an elected official or a medical professional. He was an unauthorized architect of human perception. But to Sand, and to the movement that followed, the risk of not intervening was greater than the risk of the chaos. 140 million isn't just a manufacturing statistic. That represents 140 million distinct chemically induced ego deaths, 140 million permanent shifts in human perception. Nicholas Sand was a literal terraformer of the human mind.
His final years really validate how the culture shifted around him. He lived in Lagunitas, California with his partner Gina Usharitz, completely transitioning from a hunted fugitive to a historical icon. The exact compounds he risked his life to cook in porcelain bathtubs were now being legitimized in real time.
And the ultimate culmination of this, the final validation, happens on April 23, 2017. Sand is invited to speak at the MAPS Psychedelic Science Conference in Oakland. There are 3,000 credentialed attendees from 40 countries. It's the largest gathering of psychedelic researchers and doctors in human history.
The visual of this is just striking. After a screening of a documentary about his work, this elderly, former international fugitive stands before a sea of scientists and receives a thunderous, sustained standing ovation. He looks out at the very medical establishment that is legitimizing his illegal life's work, and he asks them his core philosophical question. Who are you? Who are we? What are we doing here?
And his vault closes right after that peak moment. The very next day, April 24, 2017, Nicholas Sand dies peacefully in his sleep at age 75. He died having successfully executed the mandate he received during his first trip back in 1961.
It is an incredible narrative, but it leaves us with a deeply uncomfortable paradox that we absolutely must engage with. If a man must become an international fugitive, hunted by the combined apparatus of the global state for decades, in order to manufacture the exact chemical compounds that the medical establishment now heralds as the future of psychiatric healing, who truly possesses the moral authority to dictate the parameters of human consciousness?
That is the ultimate question, and it leaves you with a final thought to mull over. Now that these highly potent compounds are locked behind clinical walls, restricted by pharmaceutical patents, and entirely under institutional control, are we losing the radical, uncontainable essence that Sand and the Brotherhood believed was absolutely necessary for actual human evolution? Has the molecule been tamed or just rebranded by the state?
Thank you for listening to the Golden Gems podcast. We'll be back next time with another deep dive. Until then, keep exploring, keep listening, and keep celebrating the power of uncompromising voices.